This dispute between Britain and Greece needs to be resolved. Hello, welcome to Dangerous Policy, a channel aimed at intelligent people wanting to discuss important issues facing life and society. My name is Crispin, and today I'm going to discuss new developments in the long-running dispute between Britain and Greece over the Elgin marbles. What are the Elgin marbles? Well, the ancient Acropolis that sits atop of Athens had the Parthenon, built under the auspices of Pericles, the first minister of Athens at the zenith of classic Athenian power, and it was decorated by a sculptor called Phidias. Phidias being the founder, the grandfather, if you like, of the ancient classical sculptural tradition. All of those famous sculptures that you see right through to Michelangelo, where you have those grandiose human body form designs, well, that was invented essentially by Phidias and put into the Acropolis. Everything from St. Peter's Basilica right through to the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. Has been inspired by this artistic tradition. And more than half of the marbles that sat in the Acropolis are now sitting in the British Museum. In the early 19th century, Lord Elgin acquired these items from the Ottoman Empire, who at that time was subjugating the Greek state. And this has been a sore point for Greece ever since, which has felt taken advantage of and wants those marbles returned. In fact, if you go to the Acropolis, there's etchings out of where these things will go once the British finally returns these things to Greece. The British, for their part, have steadfastly always said these were acquired legally under the laws and precepts of the time, and thus they're not Greek anymore. They now belong to the British and they sit in the British Museum appropriately. The thing that I found really striking, however, was that Boris Johnson, who is without question the greatest Grecophile ever to sit in the Prime Minister's office of Great Britain, came out with a very firm statement saying that these marbles will be retained in the British Museum. And this was striking for me because Boris Johnson, he holds Pericles up as his personal idol. He hugely admires the workings of Phidias. And despite his sort of fluffy hair and his kind of, bogan persona, he's a classicist. He can speak near perfect ancient Greek. You can sit there and you can YouTube Boris Johnson reciting Homer's Iliad in the original text. Once upon a time, he also debated the famous Roman historian Mary Beard in the British Museum, a debate which was the superior culture, Greek or Roman, and he fought her to a draw. Another great debate you can watch on the internet. I'll leave the link in the description. So if anyone is going to be sympathetic to the fact that Greece is being plundered, it surely would be Boris Johnson. And yet he has steadfastly defended the British position. Now, why won't the British return these marbles? Well, partly it's for the prestige of the British Museum, no doubt. I also suspect it's because they're worried about opening the floodgates. Like if they return the marbles to Greece based on Greek demands, well, what will that say for the rest of the world that has items of its cultural heritage sitting in the British Museum? Everything from, the Persians and Mesopotamians right through to South America, will they all come out and make the same or similar demands? And will this kind of embarrass Britain on the world stage and all of the successes and heritage of the British Empire? There's probably a domestic issue in this space as well, where there's a great fight domestically within Great Britain over whether or not the British Empire was a good thing or a bad thing. A lot of kind of woke intersectionals kind of trying to tear down colonialism and say that everything about British past was oppression and subjugation and all the rest of it, which of course isn't true. But if you, open this door to all the things that are in the British Museum, might give ammunition to that voice. accordingly, I think they just don't want to open that door at all. My personal view is that the Greek diplomats and the British diplomats could sit down together and work this out, come up with a formulation of words and an agreement that shows that this is an exceptional and special case, and that this does not in any way reflect on the rest of the items and artifacts that are sitting in the British Museum. I think that would be entirely within the linguistic, diplomatic skills of the civil servants involved. Is there another reason why the British might say no? Well, there is a broader ethical question, and that is, who truly owns ancient artifacts? Is it the property solely of the country or people who created it, or the physical location in which it's based? Or are these the custodian belongings for all of humanity? Now, in the specific case of Greece, I don't think it matters too much, because the Greek government itself, of course, is enormously respectful of its classical Greek tradition and seeks to preserve those items in its museums and public displays and tourism and all the rest of it, in the same way that the British government is highly respectful of these items and preserves them in a superb way within the British Museum. But that's not true for many parts of the world. So much of our human civilization is in areas of tremendous poverty and turmoil. If we think of ancient Mesopotamia, the origins of writing, the first cities, well, we're talking Iraq, Syria, Iran, Afghanistan, southern Turkey, all these incredibly unstable parts of the world filled with serious human deprivation. It's easy to see why people would plunder these things and sell them on the open market. Of course, if we think of the Valley of the Kings of the ancient Egypt, almost every one of those pharaoh tombs have been plundered by grave robbers throughout the centuries. This is why, finding Tutankhamun's tomb was such a miracle in the 20th century. Or if you think of Tunis, ancient Carthage, the great competitor of Rome, this Phoenician city that's there in West Africa. Well, obviously, these places are being torn up and sold and given as gifts to tourists and other people just for some food. So these are things that probably just don't belong to the lowest common denominator. It's quite, if the choice is between their destruction or their dispersal into private collections, is it not better for a wealthy power with scholarly intentions to take these items and then preserve them for public display and public use throughout the ages? Surely that's the lesser of two evils. And then we see the clear-cut cases, such as the ancient Roman city of Palmyra, the birthplace of the Zenobian rebellion against the Roman Empire. Well, that was blown up by ISIS. Or you have the ancient 7th century Buddhist statues in Afghanistan destroyed by the Taliban with dynamite because they accused people of seeing them with idolatry. There must be a balance there between the two. And if you do open the door to saying, look, everything in the British Museum or everything in the Louvre can be taken out and returned to their places of origin, well, a lot of those items will never be seen again. Again, not true for the Greeks, but true for many others. And the British might be saying to themselves, look, we don't want to open that door because we seek to preserve these items for all of humanity. And we do not believe that these items belong to any individual because they didn't make them. We're thousands of years removed from that situation. There's actually one case in Australia where I'm deeply sympathetic as well. Quite controversial, what I'm about to say. But in October of last year, a new rule was introduced to say you couldn't climb Uluru, the Ayers Rock, the great rock in the middle of Australia. Well, I mean, my personal view is that this is a natural geographic feature that predates local traditional cultures by hundreds of millions of years and thus doesn't actually belong to the first Australians any more than it belongs to anybody else. And thus, if it's something that's going to attract people to the site and it's not going to damage the site in any way, it shouldn't be the rights of a small number of people to veto how people choose to enjoy it. Different matter entirely if it's an object of cultural significance that they actually created, such as cave paintings and rock art and things like that. Well, then you could say that the traditional owners of that particular territory have some say over how that site is interacted with and preserved. But is it an absolute right if we're talking about something that's tens of thousands of years, or in the case of Western civilizational culture, a few thousand years removed from the people there today? It's a big question mark. I think it's a question over the balance between preserving for future generations and respecting the traditional customs and culture of the place and of its origin. I mean, it's a difficult balancing act to form. But in the case of Greece, I think it's pretty clear that whatever the legalities of Lord whoever in the early 19th century taking these items from the Acropolis, they should be returned. The most recent polling that I've seen is still old polling, but the most recent polling that I've seen from the British public is that a majority of people in Britain think they should be returned, let alone the rest of the world. And I also think that this is a particularly sore point for Greece in terms of the time in which this occurred, right? For 1,000 years, the Greeks were the ancient custodians of the Roman tradition, right? So you had the Western Roman Empire and the Eastern Roman Empire. Western Roman Empire collapses. The Eastern Roman Empire, with the capital of Byzantium, becomes the inheritors of Rome. They called themselves Romans right through to the capture of Constantinople by the Turks in 1453. But those Romans, so-called, ended up speaking Greek, right? So the Greeks themselves are the custodians of that Roman tradition, and they had been fighting the Turks through most of that history. They had the massive defeat, the Battle of Manzikert in 1071, and then finally the loss of Constantinople, and then the subjugation of the rest of Greece under the Roman Empire, Ottoman Empire. And thus they feel quite bitter, I suspect, about the plundering of their cultural traditions at the hands of the Turks. And to have stuff while they're under the thumb of the Ottomans, then go off to Britain, I think is a double insult. So for that reason, it would be gracious for the British government to say, look, we took it from Greece at a time when Greece was under the thumb of the Ottoman Empire. We don't agree with what the Ottomans did to Greece during that time, and as a sign of that kind of respect of that history, we would like to return these items. And remember, this is the time of the Armenian genocide that the Ottomans committed in 1915. This is the time in which Greece was, there was a threat to the whole of Western Europe from the expansion of Ottoman Empire right up to the gates of Vienna. And today we have President Erdogan, who is arch enemies with the current Prime Minister of Great Britain, Boris Johnson. Boris Johnson once won a poetry competition writing a poem lampooning President Erdogan, something that is totally illegal in Turkey, showing just how much disdain Boris Johnson has for that particular dictator. So it just boggles my mind that for the sake of a deal that they had made with the Ottomans, that they're willing to insult the Greeks in this way, given that I think the Greeks and the British are kind of natural allies. Britain itself has adopted so much of its philosophical institutions from ancient Greece. If you go back to the sort of the 19th century, when you had the sort of social hierarchy, philosophy that the Brits adopted as a part of their empire, the ancient Greeks were the only ones that they placed above themselves. They said, well, okay, of all the great civilizations that have ever existed, Britain is number 2, but ancient Greece was number 1. And foremost evangelizing that view would be today's Boris Johnson, I'm sure. So for goodness sake, just return the damn rocks and then everyone can live. That's my view. Do you have a different view? Do you think that the Greek position is unreasonable? Do you think that the British Museum should retain those items just like they retain everything else? Do you think that the balance that I've sought to kind of navigate my way through in terms of between the cultural ownership of the traditional owners and the people who control territory versus those that sit in museums and scholars, that balance is right? What is your view? Please leave your comment on this down below, because I don't have all the answers on this. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel. We are growing, but we'd like to grow faster, and leave a like as well. Thank you so much, and I will see you next time.